The Man with a Stone. January 9th, 1914, Surrey, England. A cold wind swept across the fields behind a modest brick house. In the distance, a man in a tweed coat crouched by a pond, his breath visible in the morning air. He picked up a smooth, flat stone and weighed it in his hand. With a flick of his wrist, he sent it spinning across the water. 1, 2, 3, 4 skips before it vanished beneath the surface. He smiled faintly. That man was Barnes Wallis, a country engineer, an aircraft designer, and by all appearances, a quiet English gentleman. But behind those spectacles was a restless mind that refused to leave the war to soldiers alone. Inside his study, the fire crackled as he spread blueprints across the table. Most showed airplanes, designs from his days working on the R-100 airship and the Wellington bomber. But one drawing was different. It showed a sphere, a steel sphere. His wife, Mary, looked over his shoulder. "Another flying machine?" Wallis smiled. "Not quite. This one bounces." The idea had come to him during one of those simple pond-side moments. The Germans had built massive hydroelectric dams across the Ruhr Valley, the beating industrial heart of their war machine. These dams powered factories, steel plants, and weapons production. Conventional bombing couldn't touch them. Their walls were too thick, their flak guns too deadly. But Wallis believed the key wasn't brute force, it was precision. What if, he thought, a bomb could skip over the water, just like a stone, avoiding torpedo nets and exploding directly against the dam's face? To most engineers, it was madness. To Wallis, it was mathematics. He began sketching equations, balancing spin, velocity, and water resistance. The weapon, he realized, would need backspin, just like a golf ball. Dropped from low altitude at high speed, it could ricochet across the surface before striking the wall, sink to a precise depth, and detonate using the water itself to amplify the blast. He called it the bouncing bomb. But getting anyone to listen was another story. At the Air Ministry, Wallis stood before a board of skeptical officers. His proposal, Operation Chastise, was met with thin smiles and polite disbelief. "You want to bounce bombs like skipping stones?" one officer said, almost laughing. "We're fighting a war, not a village fete." Wallis nodded. "Exactly. And this is how we'll win it." He left the meeting to silence. No applause, no approval. But he had done enough in his career to know that sometimes the only way to prove an idea was to build it yourself. Back in Surrey, he built models in his shed. At first, the tests were embarrassing. The bombs bounced too soon or too late, splashing harmlessly into the pond. Neighbors complained about explosions rattling their windows. Wallis apologized politely, then went back to work. Each failure was a clue, each explosion a note in his growing symphony of trial and error. He adjusted angles, spin rates, and release heights until finally the sphere kicked perfectly, once, twice, 3 times, before striking the target dead center. He packed his notes and a small test film into a box and sent it to the Royal Air Force's 5th Bomber Command. Within days, he was summoned to London. Inside a darkened briefing room, senior officers watched the footage projected on a wall. The tiny spinning sphere flew from the model plane, bounced across the water, and struck the miniature dam. A flash of light, a plume of spray, and the dam crumbled. When the lights came up, no one laughed. "Who would fly it?" one officer asked quietly. Wallis replied, "The best, nothing less."
That answer would soon lead him to a new kind of squadron, a group of volunteers who would train for one of the most daring missions in World War II. The world would soon know them as the Dambusters.
The squadron that shouldn't exist. March 1943, RAF Scampton, Lincolnshire. The airfield was half-frozen mud and echoing hangars, wind whistling through the gaps in the tin roofs. Out on the tarmac, a new kind of bomber stood glinting in the pale light. The Avro Lancaster, the RAF's heavy-lift workhorse. It could haul the massive new weapon Barnes Wallis had designed. But few men knew what that weapon was. Inside a converted farmhouse nearby, a tall, sharp-featured officer with restless energy studied the strange blueprints spread across his desk. Wing Commander Guy Gibson, just 24 years old, already had more than 170 missions behind him. He'd faced night fighters, flak storms, and near death too many times to count. But this was different. When his commanding officer told him he'd be leading a special operations unit with an undisclosed objective, Gibson smirked. "You mean suicide squadron, don't you?" The officer replied, "Something like that." So began number 617 Squadron, a hand-picked unit of the RAF's most skilled pilots, navigators, and bomb aimers, drawn from across Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Officially, their mission didn't exist. Unofficially, they were training to destroy the Möhne, Eder, and Dams, critical to Germany's industrial might. When Wallis first met the squadron, he looked more like a country professor than a weapons designer. Soft-spoken, awkward, and meticulous. Standing before the pilots, he explained how his bouncing bomb, now codenamed Upkeep, would be delivered. "You will fly at exactly 60 feet above the water," he began. The room fell silent. "You will maintain a speed of 232 miles per hour, release the bomb at a precise distance from the dam, and achieve perfect backspin rotation." One pilot muttered, "60 feet at night? Over water?" Wallis adjusted his glasses. "Yes, and you'll need to be accurate to within 20 yards. Otherwise, the bomb will miss. Or kill you." The room erupted with nervous laughter, but no one left. These were men who lived on the knife's edge between calculation and chaos. Training began immediately. Lancaster crews flew endless night runs over reservoirs and lakes, practicing low-level approaches. Engineers fitted 2 searchlights under each bomber, one facing forward, one downward. When the 2 beams met to form a single bright circle on the surface of the water, they knew they were exactly 60 feet up. It was an ingenious, terrifying trick. Gibson drilled them mercilessly. "Precision isn't optional," he said. "You're not bombing cities, you're threading a needle." Each test run pushed the limits. Flying that low meant even small mistakes were fatal. On one training mission, a crew clipped a wave and vanished instantly. Still, morale held. They believed in the mission, or at least in Gibson's conviction. Back at his home, Wallis followed their progress with growing anxiety. His invention was finally ready for combat, but he couldn't ignore the cost. "They're risking their lives for a theory," he told Mary one night. "And if I'm wrong," she touched his arm, "then you'll know you gave them the best chance they'll ever have." By May 1943, everything was ready. The Upkeep bomb, a massive steel cylinder weighing over 9,000 pounds, was mounted beneath each Lancaster. Special motors inside the bomb would spin it backward at 500 revolutions per minute before release, ensuring it skipped over the surface. The code name for the mission, Operation Chastise.
On May 16, 1943, the squadron assembled in the briefing room at Scampton. Maps of the Ruhr Valley covered the walls. Gibson stood at the front, pointer in hand. "This," he said, tapping the Möhne Dam, "is your target. You will fly in low, under radar. You will drop your bomb from this distance, at this height, at this speed. There's no margin for error, none." He looked at the faces before him, 19 crews, each hand-picked, each knowing the odds. Then he smiled. "Let's go and make a little history, shall we?" At 9:28 p.m., the first bombers roared down the runway, heavy and silent under the dusk sky. Wallis stood by the airfield's edge, coat pulled tight against the wind, watching his dream, his strange, impossible invention, disappear into the night. Somewhere over Europe, his homemade bomb would soon face its moment of truth.
The night the dams burst. May 16th to 17th, 1943, over the Ruhr Valley, Germany. The moon hung low over the clouds as 19 Lancasters crossed the Dutch coast in 3 waves, hugging the earth so closely that their propeller wash rippled the treetops. At just 60 feet above the ground, even the slightest miscalculation meant disaster. Beneath them stretched miles of enemy territory, radar stations, flak towers, and searchlights sweeping the night like white blades. In the cockpit of the lead bomber, Guy Gibson sat calm and steady, his gloved hands tight on the control column. Below, dark lakes and villages slid by in ghostly silence. Every few seconds, tracer fire arced upward from the ground, blooming orange against the black. "Hold her steady," his navigator murmured. "Speed 232, altitude 60. Right, we're on." Far behind them, the second wave wasn't so lucky. One Lancaster clipped high-voltage wires over the Rhine and exploded in a blinding fireball. Another was torn apart by flak. Still, the survivors pressed on, each pilot knowing that one precise drop could alter the course of the war. At 12:28 a.m., Gibson's bomber approached the Möhne Dam, a vast wall of concrete rising 130 feet above the reservoir. The surface was calm, reflecting the moon like glass. The German gunners atop the dam hadn't spotted them yet. "Bomb door open," Gibson ordered. The engineer flipped the switch. The whir of the bomb motor filled the cabin as the upkeep began to spin. "Distance to release, 800 yards, the bomb aimer whispered. The twin searchlights beneath the Lancaster converged into a single glowing circle on the water, perfect height. 500 yards, Gibson gritted his teeth. "Steady, steady, drop it!" The bomb fell away, spinning backwards as it struck the reservoir. 1, 2, 3 skips, each impact sending plumes of spray into the air before it slammed into the dam's wall and sank. A flash, then a roar. A column of water surged skyward as the shockwave tore through the dam's structure. Gibson's plane jolted as the blast hit the airframe. His gunner looked down in awe. "God almighty, did you see that?" But the wall held, cracked, wounded, but still standing. "Second run," Gibson said. "We'll mark it for the others." One by one, the remaining bombers came in, flying low through flak and smoke. Flight Lieutenant Hopgood's plane was hit before release, flames trailing from a wing. He held steady just long enough to drop his bomb before crashing into the valley below. The explosion shook the dam again, widening the cracks. The third bomber lined up, Pilot Officer Martin, and his bomb hit dead center. The second stretched. Then, with a thunder that rolled across the valley, the Möhne Dam gave way. The concrete wall split open like a wound, releasing a tidal wave of water that tore through the valley below. Factories, power stations, and bridges vanished under the torrent. It was as if a new river had been unleashed, one made of vengeance and gravity.
From above, Gibson's crew watched in stunned silence as the floodwaters raced across the moonlit landscape. "She's gone," his gunner whispered. "By God, she's gone." Minutes later, the squadron turned toward the Eder Dam, threading through mountains and mist. The approach was even harder, twisting turns, low valleys, invisible hazards. 2 more bombers were lost before the Eder finally fell, collapsing in a cascade of white fury. By dawn, the survivors were on their way home, engines coughing and wings scarred with flak holes. Only 11 of the 19 aircraft made it back. 53 men were dead or missing. At RAF Scampton, ground crews waited under a cold morning sky. When the first Lancaster touched down, the airfield erupted in cheers, relief and grief mixed together. Barnes Wallis was there too. He rushed forward as Gibson stepped off the plane, exhausted but smiling faintly. "Did it work?" Wallis asked, voice shaking. Gibson nodded. It worked. For a moment, the inventor simply stood there, unable to speak. He had spent years imagining the sight, the weapon that bounced, the water that destroyed, but the reality of it left him hollow. Later, when told of the casualties, Wallis broke down in tears. "I feel like I've murdered them," he whispered. But history would remember the night differently, not as a tragedy, but as a turning point. The Dambusters had done the impossible.
The flood that shook the Reich. May 17th, 1943. The Ruhr Valley, Germany. At dawn, the valley that once powered Hitler's war machine lay drowning beneath chaos. Entire villages were gone. The Möhne River, swollen with millions of tons of released water, surged through farmland and factories alike. Bridges twisted like paper. Power stations sparked, short-circuited, and went dark. In the industrial heart of the Reich, production stopped. The floodwaters roared down the valley for over 50 miles, sweeping away supply depots, locomotives, and everything in their path. Eyewitnesses described it as a living creature, a wall of gray fury devouring everything the Nazis had built. The Eder Dam, shattered hours later, unleashed its own torrent that joined the Möhne's, cutting deep into the infrastructure of the Ruhr. In Berlin, panic rippled through the corridors of the German High Command. Reports came in piece by piece. Communications down, power grids offline, ironworks flooded. The once invincible network that fueled the Luftwaffe, the panzer divisions, and the munitions plants had been struck at its core. When Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, visited the scene days later, he was stunned. The destruction was greater than anything our own bombers could have done, he later admitted. The Nazi propaganda machine tried to minimize the damage, calling it temporary flooding, but the truth was clear. Operation Chastise had hit Germany where it was most vulnerable, its heart, its industry, its confidence. Back in England, the world called them heroes. Newspapers splashed headlines like "The Dams are Down" and "RAF's Daring Triumph." A war-weary Britain, reeling from years of bombing and rationing, finally had a story of hope, of ingenuity and courage that could strike back at the empire of fear. At RAF Scampton, the surviving crews of No. 617 Squadron were decorated for their bravery. Guy Gibson received the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor. His composure, leadership, and precision under fire became legend. When reporters asked him about the mission, Gibson gave a quiet smile and said, "We just did our job." Barnes Wallis, standing among the celebration, remained silent. Pride and grief warred inside him. He had watched his idea transform from a sketch on paper to a weapon of war, a weapon that had worked exactly as he dreamed, and at a terrible cost. When told of the destruction in the Ruhr, he simply nodded and said, "I only ever wanted to shorten the war."
and in a way he had. The operation forced the Germans to divert thousands of workers and vast resources to rebuild the dams, resources that could no longer be used for weapons, tanks, or aircraft. It also proved that precision bombing, hitting a single vital target rather than whole cities, could change the balance of war. The lessons learned at the Ruhr would shape Allied strategy for the rest of the conflict. Months later, as the war dragged on, No. 617 Squadron was given a new nickname, the Dambusters. They would go on to specialize in precision strikes using advanced weapons inspired by Wallis's innovations. His ideas about accuracy, aerodynamics, and targeted destruction would echo far beyond World War II, influencing everything from post-war aviation design to modern guided munitions. But for Wallis, the legacy was personal. In his journal, he wrote a single line that captured the paradox of invention in wartime. An engineer's triumph is always shadowed by the cost of its success. May 15, 1945. 2 years later, Germany surrendered. The dams were long rebuilt, but the myth of their invincibility never recovered. Across the world, the story of the Dambusters became a symbol of imagination defeating power, of courage triumphing over odds. In his quiet Surrey home, Barnes Wallis once again walked to the pond behind his house. He picked up a stone, turned it over in his hand, and threw it. It skipped twice before sinking, a small ripple spreading across the water. He smiled faintly. It was never about destruction. It was about precision, persistence, and the stubborn belief that even one man with one idea could change the world.